So this webinar series really focuses on um, if we can culling decisions for animals, right? And so a critical part of that really is transportation, particularly for our young calves. And so today we're going to talk about a few different things. And I first want to propose to you this idea that transportation, if not managed correctly, can be a bottleneck to success in our calf raising programs. We'll then talk about how management influences calf welfare at each stage of transport, then discuss how can we minimize transportation stress for calves, and then what are some larger questions that we need to consider about the existing supply chain. So just to begin with an overview, approximately 9.5 million calves are born annually in the US on dairies. And these can be broken into buckets of replacement calves and non-replacements. And so a lot of the transport research has focused on our non-replacements, but actually about 40% of our replacement heifers are raised off-site. We know that on average, they leave the operation around 3 days of age to go to a heifer raiser. And approximately 15% of operations are transporting calves more than 50 miles. And so these are our calves that obviously are going to enter our milking herd. And so while we're not typically making culling decisions on these animals at this point in their life, we are still transporting them. And that's really critical to think about when we consider the long-term productivity of these animals. Our non-replacement calves can be male dairy calves or male or female beef on dairy calves. Now, our male dairy calves have historically had a low value, although that's certainly not the case right now. And because of that historical low value, sometimes we saw these calves receive some suboptimal management. But recently with beef prices the way they are and the increased use of beef on dairy, we're seeing a lot of non-replacement calves right now, which means that a ton of non-replacements are actually leaving the dairy at a pretty young age. And so 80% of these calves are actually transported off-site at less than a week of age. We did some work here in the Western United States that shows that about 60% of those calves actually are leaving the dairy at less than 24 hours of age. The data that we do have says that they're going an average of about 140 miles, but certainly that can vary. And depending on region and the agreement between the buyer and the dairy, these calves might be directly transported to their destination, but many times these calves are going to be transported to an auction facility or a livestock market and then transported again to their destination. And they actually might go through 1, 2, 3, or even 4 livestock auctions before they get to their final destination. And so I think we have a question for you all in the poll, but I want to know, what are your goals for your calf program? And this should include non-replacements, but also your replacements as well. And so hopefully maybe Catherine can read those to me as they're coming in.
Okay, so folks are typing in their answers.
Yeah.
So I was just giving them a minute or two, or
Yeah, no worries.
like to do that. When it slows down, I'll
Yeah, and really the reason I'm asking this is because while transport, for these young calves might just occur in one day out of their life, I really want us to think about what are the overall goals for our calf program and how transportation can potentially impact those goals. And so that's really the reason that I'm asking these questions.
So Kathy, I can read the answers that
Oh,
popped up.
okay, good.
And so we have lots of different answers. Correct size at freshening. One person said not applicable. Healthy animals, promote welfare and natural behavior, healthy calves, improve genomic return, as well as increase efficiency and production.
Awesome. Yeah, those are great. And we're going to touch on those throughout the presentation. And then my next question is, what gets in the way of achieving those goals? So we heard a lot about calf welfare and behavior, ensuring that they remain healthy, that they're the correct size at freshening, growth, increased productivity. But what gets in the way of achieving those goals?
A few more people are answering this one, Katie.
Yeah, perfect.
So Betsy, can you see the replies?
Yep.
Can you go
So
ahead and read them then?
yes. So we have inadequate monitoring of size, prioritizing weight over size, diseases, facilities, humans, owners, management, and employees, and another people, protocol drift, people again, too high ratio of animals to people, people again, owners not creating culture of care.
Yeah, great. Thank you all for providing that input. So we heard a lot about people, right? And management. And as we all know, really how we manage these calves dictates whether they're going to be successful or not, whether that's entering the milking herd one day or going directly into the beef supply chain like our non-replacements. And so many of you mentioned that you want to raise healthy and productive and profitable calves, but that things like disease or other management challenges get in the way. And so today I'm going to share data that demonstrates that transportation is stressful for young calves. And when we think about stress in young animals, that can make them more susceptible to disease, which in turn can decrease calf performance. And because of that, if we don't manage these animals correctly, early life transportation can be a bottleneck to success in calf raising. And so as we go through this, I'll share some data that talks about how and why it's stressful for calves, and then leave you with some strategies of how we can manage calves effectively to minimize these consequences. So keep in mind, I said that calves are leaving the dairy at less than a week of age, most of them. And so that means we're transporting neonatal calves. And young calves are highly susceptible to stress and disease. And the reason for that is that our young calves have underdeveloped immune systems and physiologic stress responses. And so there's a lot going on in this figure, but really what I want to draw your attention to is that age is along the middle here. And we have maternal antibodies that those calves are getting from colostrum. Those are peaking around 3 days of age. Really, we don't see that calf begin to really mount an immune response of their own until they're at least 3 or 4 weeks of age. And so when we think about when we're transporting those animals, we're transporting them at a time when they really don't have a fully functioning immune system. And also, during this time, calves are not able to respond and recover from stress as easily as an adult would. And they also have a difficult time regulating their body temperature, right? We all know that when it's really cold outside or when it's really hot, our calves struggle and we have to change management to support them. And so this transport is a challenge that we're asking calves to undergo, particularly when they're highly susceptible to stress and disease. And at the same time, we want them to have a healthy and productive life. And the stressors associated with transportation, and this is in cattle, but it's pretty much species wide that this happens. And particularly in calves, the stressors that we think of with transportation include commingling with other animals, and that could be on the trailer or at the livestock or marketing facility, extreme weather conditions, improper handling that can occur if we don't have our employees trained correctly, which some of you mentioned earlier, a lack of bedding in the trailer, exposure to pathogen, or no milk or water. And so what that means for the calf is that they can be easily become dehydrated. They might experience discomfort, disease, depletion of energy, fear, hunger, injury, thermal stress, and thirst. And these can result in all of these types of stress that I mentioned for calves. And when an animal experiences stress, it makes them more susceptible to disease. And so during transport, we talked about calves are going to experience thermal stress because it's too hot or too cold, nutritional stress because they don't have access to milk or water, and they're commingled. And all of these we know make a calf more likely to become sick. Many of you mentioned that growth is an important part of your calf program, and disease negatively impacts average daily gain, and it can also impact size of the animal too, like one of the audience members mentioned. We know that an average daily gain loss of anywhere from 0.01 to 1.7 pounds can occur when calves are sick. So disease impacts those calves and how they grow. And if we're thinking about raising a productive and profitable animal, that pre-weaned average daily gain is critical for future milk production. So we know that for every 1 pound of pre-weaned average daily gain, first lactation milk yield increases by 1,200 pounds. And so if we're not reaching that 1 pound goal, we're losing $255 just on milk alone. For our non-replacement animals, the ones who are going directly into the beef supply chain, we also know that calfhood disease and poor growth are associated with reduced carcass quality, lower hot carcass rate, a lower price at auction, and those animals are more likely to have additional diseases. We've got additional labor costs. Those animals are more likely to die, and treatment costs as well. And so not only do we see the animal experience some really challenging things from an animal welfare perspective, but this also affects profitability and performance of these animals. And so again, we all mentioned that you want calf programs to be profitable, that we want our cows to experience good welfare, for them to be healthy and productive. And so if we don't manage transportation correctly, that's a huge stressor for these calves early in life that can make them more susceptible to disease and reduce performance, not to mention the significant welfare implications that go along with that. Now I'm going to talk about some challenges with transport at each stage along that journey that those calves make. And really, pre-transport management decisions impact calves n- immediately and long term. And so that source dairy is really critical for preparing that calf for transport. And so we can decide, do we set the calves up for success or do we set them up for failure? And it really starts at that source dairy. So things like colostrum, preconditioning, and preconditioning is a term we probably think of mostly in beef cattle, but I think it's just a term that refers to preparing an animal for their next stage of production. And so we can think about management practices that we do on the dairy that set them up for success during and after transportation, and also fitness for transport. So colostrum practices at the source dairy can vary. We know that, again, because of that historical low value of male dairy calves that I've mentioned previously, it's documented that male dairy calves have been more likely to receive contaminated colostrum, delayed colostrum feedings, and a lower total volume of colostrum. When we look at failed transfer of passive immunity, a Canadian study found that approximately 12% of calves had failed transfer of passive immunity, and a US study found that 23% of calves did. We recently conducted a survey of producers in the US about their pre-transport management practices. And one of the questions we asked them was about colostrum timing, and we asked them by calf class. So this graph is just showing the time that they got their first colostrum feeding, and then the percent of operations. And so you can see that the majority of operations were getting colostrum into calves less than 1 hour and 1 to 2 hours of age. And we did see a difference in calf class. So we asked about replacement heifers, beef on dairy, and bull calves. And what we found is that more operations fed colostrum to replacements earlier than non-replacements. And so although we're seeing the majority of operations providing colostrum within that 2-hour time frame, we definitely saw a difference between replacements and non-replacements. For colostrum quantity, we asked about the total volume of colostrum that they get prior to getting on the trailer. And we found that most operations were feeding a similar quantity to replacement heifers, beef on dairy, and bull calves. And they made sure that at least those calves got at least 4 quarts of colostrum prior to getting on the trailer. And so I think that shows that, potentially our industry is moving in the right direction in quantity, but we can certainly look at improving the timeliness of that. And so that was colostrum. So the next question we asked on this survey was about preconditioning practices. So we asked them about electrolytes, navel dipping, supplements, and vaccines. The most common preconditioning practice was navel dipping, and over 80% of operations reported doing that. The next critical thing that we looked at, excuse me, that several studies have looked at, is fitness for transport. So we often think of that in adult cattle, but really fitness for transport is a critical issue in our young dairy calves. This is a Canadian study that looked at the condition of calves on dairies prior to them getting loaded on the trailer. They found that that 37% of calves had at least one health abnormality. And so that included things like dull or depressed attitude, fever, respiratory disease, diarrhea, or navel infections. And so about 40% of calves had abnormal health conditions prior to getting on the trailer. In the Western US, we actually found that approximately half of calves had at least one health abnormality prior to getting on the trailer. And the most prevalent diseases were dehydration and diarrhea. So this is going back to the survey data that I mentioned, and we asked dairies, we gave them a series of conditions, and we said, would you transport a calf with these conditions? So you can see that 20 to 30% of operations said they'd transport calves if they had diarrhea. A similar proportion said they'd transport calves if they were dehydrated. Anywhere from 30 to 55% said that they would transport calves with navel inflammation, and 30 to 40% said they would transport calves if they've not received the minimum feeding of colostrum. And when we're transporting compromised calves or calves in suboptimal condition, or calves that are not well prepared for transport, those stressors that we talked about with transportation are compounded. They get even worse. We also know that disease conditions can worsen throughout transit. And when we think about our sick animals, those calves have a unique set of needs, and it it makes it nearly impossible for us to provide what a sick animal needs when they're transported with other calves. We also see that the decisions we make at the dairy about which calves we put on the trailer not only impacts them during transportation, but it also has long-term effects. So, for example, calves that had a navel infection at the source dairy were almost 3 times as likely to be treated for diarrhea at the calf raiser. If they were dull or depressed at the dairy, they were 2.5 times more likely to die at the calf raiser. So again, we're seeing short and long-term impacts. And I'll keep coming back to this slide because it is so important. If we want our animals to live healthy, comfortable, productive lives, we've got to make good decisions early on in that calf's life because what we do impacts them now and down the road. So now we'll talk a little bit about welfare challenges in transit. So we touched on these a little bit earlier, but I think it's really critical for us to spend a little bit more time on this. We know that most calves don't have access to milk or water when they're on the trailer, and often not even when they're in the marketing facilities. Young calves just don't have the energy stores that our older animals do. And so they quickly can have their energy depleted. They might experience dehydration and electrolyte imbalance, low blood sugar or hypoglycemia, and this results in hunger and thirst, right? And many of you mentioned how important it was that the calves had good welfare, and that's a critical welfare concern. If calves are not handled properly, that can result in stress and fear. We know that calves are going to spend approximately 70% of their time on the trailer laying down. And so if we don't have good, dry, um, comfortable bedding, that can lead to some discomfort and injury for those calves. If they're exposed to pathogens, we can see disease. Commingling can also be a risk factor for disease, but also results in stress and fear. And then extreme weather. If we think about our young calves, less than a week of age that we're transporting, their kind of comfortable temperature zone is between 50 to 77 degrees Fahrenheit. That's not very wide. And when we get outside of that temperature range, that calf has to use extra energy in order to maintain normal body temperature. And so when we're transporting them, that can lead to thermal distress, discomfort, and dehydration. And so we're asking a calf, again, who's a neonate, to overcome these and go on to live a productive life. The marketing process presents some additional stressors for calves. So nearly 70% of male dairy calves go through auctions, and approximately a third of those calves are sold more than one time. They don't have access to milk or water oftentimes during marketing. They experience new environments and animals. They may experience a variety of handling techniques and commingling. And again, all of these are stressful for our young calves. When we look at the condition of calves arriving at auction facilities, 20% of calves at auctions in California, in Canada, arrived with at least one of the following. So navel disease, that was the most common. Eye or nasal discharge, a depressed attitude or dull, unable or unwilling to rise, coughing, and joint inflammation. So that's the condition of calves arriving at auctions. And remember, they have to go through that auction process, get put back on a trailer, and go to their final destination. And now we're going to talk about the condition of calves at arrival to their destination. So, one study looked at the condition of bob veal calves in the US, and they found that 96% of those calves, so nearly all of them, had at least one health abnormality. 82% had at least two health abnormalities. We found for non-replacements going to a calf ranch, and these calves stayed in the same state. They didn't cross state lines. Over half of those calves were dehydrated when they got off that trailer. So calves are either starting their journey compromised, so we're not making ideal decisions at the dairy, or they're becoming compromised throughout their transportation journey, or a combination of the two. So this was our survey data again, except this time we asked calf raisers. And so we asked them if in the last year they had any calves arrive with the following condition. So this graph is showing the proportion of calf raisers that reported having pre-weaned calves arriving to their destination with an abnormal condition. Nearly 80% of raisers said that they had calves getting off the trailer with diarrhea. Almost 70% said they had calves arriving with navel inflammation, 60% with dehydration. Over half of operations said they had some calves arriving who had difficulty breathing. And we also saw operations reporting having calves arrive with failed transfer of passive immunity, so they didn't get adequate colostrum, respiratory disease, bone fractures, severe lameness, calves that were non-ambulatory, and extremely thin. And so transportation is stressful for calves, right? And that's exacerbated when we ship them in suboptimal conditions. So if we're shipping sick, injured, or calves who are not well prepared for transport, that's a significant welfare concern. It can make it even more stressful, put them at a greater risk for disease. And again, that's going to impact not only animal welfare, but performance now and down the road. And so based on the data and what we know so far, we really have ample opportunities to improve how we manage calves before, during, and after transportation. And now we're going to talk about how we can minimize transportation stress for calves. So I'm going to share 5 strategies. The first is retaining calves at the source dairy for longer. So waiting until they're a little bit older to ship them. Focusing on preconditioning, assessing fitness for transport, handling calves with care, and reducing transport duration and events. So keeping calves at the source dairy for longer, age is one of the factors that's been studied a little bit in calves. So a Canadian study shipped calves at different ages. And so when calves who were at least 7 days of age compared to calves who were 2 to 6 days of age, those older calves had greater average daily gain during the first 50 days at a veal facility and reduced incidence of abnormal respiratory scores compared to calves who were shipped at 2 to 6 days of age. Calves who were 12 to 19 days of age had a reduced odds of navel inflammation compared to younger calves. And then here in the Western US, we found that calves who were at least 1 to 3 days of age at transport had a reduced odds of being dehydrated prior to transport compared to calves who were less than 24 hours of age. And in fact, we found that just one more day at the dairy reduced the odds of dehydration by 5 times. And so we're seeing really a significant impact of age. Next is focusing on preconditioning. And remember, we can think about this as practices that are intended to help calves succeed during their next phase of production, such as transportation and then after at calf raising facilities. So again, what we do at the dairy impacts that calf now and down the road. And first and foremost, we need to have a good colostrum program. And we also want to make sure that we have assurances in place that ensures every calf gets an optimal amount um, and timeliness of colostrum. Because once they leave the dairy and they get on that trailer, um, it might be too late for us if we haven't gotten the colostrum in her correctly. Next is navel disinfection and navel care. So young calves, you all know that umbilicus is going to be kind of open and it can really act as a wick. And so anything that is in that environment can be taken up by that navel and it can go directly to the liver and bladder and cause significant issues for that calf, particularly if they're in a dirty environment. And we also know that calves are going to lay down most of the time too. So that navel is touching whatever's in that environment. So making sure that we've provided correct navel care, and of course, making sure that that environment is clean for that calf, both in the maternity area and on the trailer. Next is milk and water. So one of the things that we talked about a lot is calves being dehydrated and calves um, having low blood sugar. And really what we found from research so far is that the best thing for calves is milk. And so providing a milk feeding of at least 2 liters as close to transportation as possible is really critical. And then providing access to clean and fresh water at all times, particularly during the marketing phase, is going to be critical as well. Next is fitness for transport. And when we talk about fitness for transport, we're talking about the calf's ability to withstand transportation without compromising their welfare. As I mentioned, it's talked about a lot in adult cows, and rightfully so. But we also really need to be thinking about this and putting these practices in place for calves as well. We know that calves are well prepared for transport when they receive high quality colostrum in a timely manner, when their navels are disinfected, when they have access to milk and water, and when they're older. Calves with the following conditions are not fit for transport: if they're dehydrated, ill, or sick, or injured, if they're lethargic or depressed, if they have navel swelling, or if they're unable to stand on their own. We should not be transporting those calves. Next is to handle calves with care. So we want to go slow and be patient, be gentle. We can think about the time of day. So if it's really, really hot, can we ship them during a cooler part of the day? If it's really cold, can we do things like adding extra bedding that's dry and clean, and even putting on calf jackets as well? Clean and dry bedding is really going to be critical because you're ensuring that calf is comfortable. We know they're going to lay down most of the time on that trailer, and you're preventing the potential for pathogen exposure as well. The last solution that I'll talk about is reducing transport duration and events. Transport duration is probably the most widely studied factor in transportation, because we know it has such a critical impact on these animals. So a Canadian study compared 16 hours of transit versus 6 hours. So those calves who were transported 16 hours had higher levels of dehydration, greater body weight loss, and an increased incidence of diarrhea in the 14 days after transport. So you're seeing not just an impact when they get off the trailer, but for up to and even beyond 2 weeks after at the calf raiser. A study in New Zealand found that for each additional hour in transit, the odds of mortality increased 1.5 times. So the longer they're on the trailer, the more at risk they are for dying during or after transit. One thing to keep in mind is that distance doesn't equal duration. So an example that I think of is we did a study here, and it took us approximately 40 minutes to drive from the dairy to the calf raiser. But calves are often on that trailer for up to 8 or 10 hours. And the reason for that is if they're going around and picking up calves at multiple dairies, those calves, if they're first on the trailer, they're going to be on there the longest. And so just because the calf raiser might only be 40 minutes away, it doesn't necessarily mean the calf's only going to be on the trailer for 40 minutes. Also, if we can ship them direct to destination, that reduces their time that they're off milk. It reduces the loading and unloading events, and it gets them to their final destination more quickly. Also, finding operations closer to the dairy farm can really go a long way to help these calves as well. One interesting thing that has been examined is a rest period. And so a Canadian study looked at putting calves on trailers for 16 hours versus 8 hours in transit plus 8 hours of rest with 2 milk feedings and 8 hours in transit again. So same total duration in transit, but one group had that 8-hour rest period with milk in between. And what they found was that calves that received a rest period and milk maintained energy and had higher growth, but they spent more time the next day. They spent more time lying the next day. And so the authors really thought this might be due to the fact that the calves were tired. And so the data we have so far is unclear whether a rest period improves the ability of calves to withstand transportation. What we do have shows that the benefits are minimal, but really more work is needed to understand how we can best support these calves throughout their transit journey. So those are 5 things we can do. A lot of them are within our current supply chain, but I think it's important for us to kind of take a step back and think about the supply chain as a whole. How we buy and sell calves is challenging. If we're shipping newborn calves, sometimes asking them to be transported, over 20 hours, perhaps being loaded and unloaded multiple times, the system is challenging and it doesn't easily lend itself to optimize calf welfare. And so I think we can think about how can we add accountability throughout the supply chain, and what are some things we can do um, to help address some of these welfare challenges that we see. When we think about the supply chain, I think there's a bit of a disconnect between dairies and calf raisers. This was the same survey that I mentioned earlier, and so we asked dairies, would you add additional preconditioning practices? And over 80% of dairy operations said yes, they would. And they would need a minimum of $10 a head to do that. We asked calf raisers, would you consider requiring additional preconditioning practices? Over 80% of calf raisers also said, yes, we would consider that. But the maximum premium they would be willing to pay for that would be $5 a head. So there's seems to be a willingness or at least an interest in adding some preconditioning practices and some accountability throughout the supply chain. But when it comes down to price, there's a disconnect. Similarly, we asked dairies and calf raisers, what are your biggest challenges relative to um, kind of calf transport and calf raising as a whole? Dairy said their first concern, their biggest challenge was labor costs. The second was low price of calves. So when calf prices are low, it was difficult for them. And also space availability for calves in case pickup was delayed. Calf raisers, on the other hand, their largest challenge was the calf health on arrival. The second was the distance from dairies, and the third was the calf health during the milk feeding phase. So you can see that when we talk about perceived challenges, there's not a ton of overlap here. And so our current procurement model, that's the reality we live in, right? And so what can we do within that existing model to make it better for the calves? I think management changes can incrementally improve calf welfare. So we can do a lot of different things to um, help calves cope better with transportation and make transportation itself a little bit less stressful. Can we think about adding more accountability throughout the supply chain, such as disincentives, preconditioning agreements, audits, things like giving feedback from the calf raiser back to the dairy? That can be really valuable as well. What are some strategies we can implement or consider to increase the value of calves? Like I said, calf prices right now are really great, but we know that they haven't always been. And then I think we need to continue to investigate strategies to mitigate stress during all phases of transportation. And I think there's some programs that are, in the early stages of looking like at this, such as calf care quality assurance, and what other programs or resources are available for us to ensure that really we're managing these animals in an optimal way. I think one thing that's interesting is to consider what's being done in other countries. So Canada has a somewhat similar calf procurement model that we do, and they've come out recently with some transport regulations around calves because they recognize how that it's stressful. And so if a calf is less than 8 days of age, they can't be transported longer than 12 hours. And if they're less than 8 days of age, they have to be loaded and unloaded individually. They have to have ample space to lie down. They have to be segregated from older animals. They cannot go through an auction facility or an assembly yard. They can't be reloaded after they've been unloaded. And again, the time from start of loading to the end of unloading has to be less than 12 hours. And so I think it's just interesting to look at other countries and what they're doing in terms of regulating this. So where do we go from here? I think first and foremost, we've got to increase some communication among the supply chain sectors. Getting feedback from calf raisers to the dairy can be really valuable. Can we implement some training programs that can help us better care for calves before, during, and after transport? And then what are strategies we can implement to optimize peri-transport or the time or managing calves around the time of transportation? So if we come back to our slide here that you're probably a little bit tired of seeing maybe, if we go back to the goals at the beginning that you all shared, you told me that you wanted calves to have good welfare. You wanted them to be healthy. You wanted them to grow well and be productive. And so if we really think about those end goals in mind, we have to recognize that transportation can be a bottleneck to success in calf raising because it's stressful for calves and because early life stress can have both short and long-term impacts on that calf. So just want to acknowledge Erica Machuca, who's a graduate student that worked with me, who did a lot of the survey work that I mentioned. The University of Wisconsin Extension, they helped us a ton with distributing that survey. And then my colleagues who've done a lot of this work with me, Doctors Jessica Pimpek, Noah Ramon Muniz, Lily Edwards Calloway, and then also my wonderful colleagues at Calf Compass. So with that, I will pause and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Catie. That was really an excellent presentation. Really brought out a lot of the points and factors that we were hoping that you would share today. So
Great.
appreciate it.